My daughter, who passed away 4 years ago, called at 1 a.m. Open the door, I'm cold. So I sat very still, with the phone pressed to my ear and the clock's green digits stabbing the dark. 1 o'clock. Rain had started again, a thin, steady scraping on the window pane, like the sound of time being rubbed away. I could hear the caller ID blink, and then nothing but breathing, a small, urgent breath that tasted like jazzin and old habits. For a long time I did nothing, not out of fear so much as disbelief, like a reflex that comes with loss, the way you look for a pulse on an empty chest. I remember the photograph on the hallway table, 2 girls with matching hair ribbons, Beatrice smiling at the camera as if she knew a secret. I touched the frame and my fingers left a warm circle on the glass. My hands trembled enough that my wedding ring caught the lamplight and made a small, precise reflection on the wall. My Beatrice, I whispered into the phone, because there was nothing else. The voice on the line answered, the syllables unmistakable even after 4 years of absence. It was thinner, as if someone had wrapped her in too many blankets and the words were trying to find daylight. The same rhythm of speech, the small pause she always made before a joke. Mom, she said, open the door, I'm cold. In that instant, I felt 2 worlds overlap, the world where she had gone and the one I was still living in. I listened for the sound of the hallway outside my apartment, for the scrape of shoes on concrete, for an umbrella being closed. Anything a living person would make at my door. I heard the rain, and a faint metallic sound, like the clink of a key against a ring. My feet moved without my permission. I crossed the room and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The building's fluorescent lights hummed their same indifferent note. There was no shadow under the door, no movement beyond a smear of wet on the mat that could have been anything, water tracked from a shoe, a dog's muddy paw. For a moment the world rearranged itself so that hope and grief pressed together like 2 pieces of glass. I wanted to open that door even if nothing was there. I wanted to fling it wide and find Beatrice standing in the rain with that ridiculous blue umbrella she always carried, the one with the chipped handle and the faded cartoon dolphin she thought was fashionable at 16. I closed the door carefully, almost apologetically, because I knew how fragile memory was. You do not let it be trampled by impulse. I sat back down, and the phone still in my hand felt heavier than a stone. I should have called someone, my neighbor, the building manager, the police, but the thought of explaining what I had just heard felt like opening a wound that the world wasn't ready to see. Who would believe me? Who would want to? Grief has a private geography. Most people are content to leave it fenced off. She called again before I decided anything. This time the call lasted longer, and she spoke of small things, the way the jasmine near our kitchen window used to bloom and slightly late, the sound of our old clock that used to tick louder on lonely nights. Remember the blue umbrella? She asked. The words hit me like a hand on the shoulder. The blue umbrella was a silly, private relic from a summer when she and I stood under the awning of a closed cafe and laughed at how ridiculous it looked when she tried to twirl it like a dancer. No one else knew where or why that umbrella mattered. I started to take notes, not because I trusted my mind more than my heart, but because the sound of her voice, the details she dropped, small, impossible comforts, began to stitch themselves into a rope I could hold. I kept the phone close and listened as if hanging on to a confession. Once she said a phrase she and I used to say to each other when the night felt too big. Light the inner heart. It was the tiniest thing, a private code for keep going, and she said it as if to remind me not to be afraid. The next morning, the evidence came in the daylight. I opened the door to throw out the trash and found a small, wet footprint on the welcome mat. It was not much, barely larger than a tea saucer, but it was there, darker than the rest of the mat, and it had the precise, stubborn shape of a child's foot. Around the knob of the door, there was a faint smudge, like the ghost of a hand. When I ran my finger along the smudge, I found a single ridge, as if someone had pressed a fingertip there with deliberate force. It could have been anything, a trick of the cleaning, a neighbor's habit, but it pulled the night back into focus with the authority of a photograph. I took photographs on my old phone, because the world demands objects you can hold up and show, proof you can press into other people's palms. I would later wish I had recorded everything from the beginning, the calls, the smell in the hallway, the small wetness of the footprint, but at the time I was learning that disbelief has its own rhythm. First denial, then curiosity, then the confusing, stubborn insistence that maybe, just maybe, the dead have not stopped trying to fix what they left undone. I told Father Antonio what had happened at the church 2 blocks away. He is a quiet man with kind eyes and a way of tilting his head when someone tells him something impossible. He always listens as if what you say is the most important thing he has heard that day. He prayed with me that Sunday and placed his hand over mine like a bridge. He did not tell me to leave the matter be. He did not say definitive things about spirits or sermons. He offered a candle and let me light it. The flame looked small and ridiculous in my hand, and then it looked like a lighthouse. He told me to write everything down, so I did. I filled notebooks with times and phrases, with the small details no one would consider when filing a police report. The exact way jasmine smells when it rains, the creak of the floorboard under the hallway lamp, the little chip in the teacup Beatrice favored. Memory needs anchors. I learned to trust the anchors more than I trusted my own wishful thinking. The more I wrote, the less I could keep myself from telling Raphael. He had been a quiet figure in our lives for years, a reporter who once came to my door with a stack of notes about Beatrice's case and left with coffee stains on his sleeve and a promise to look deeper. When the case closed, it closed with the polite certainty of an accident, a late-night car, a driver who ran, a line in the paper about tragic misfortune. Raphael had left the night with a look in his eye that said he didn't believe it, but he had to keep a roof over his apartment and stories to chase. Years passed. He called sometimes about small things, an anniversary piece or a local man's obituary. When I told him the phone had rung at 1 a.m., he came by the next day with a recorder, a thermos of coffee, and too many questions. He joked once about being nosy, but his knuckles went white when he gripped the recorder, as if he knew its weight would matter. We decided to test it together, with the recorder between us like a third witness. The plan was simple and irrational. Answer the next call, recorded. Make sure my hearing wasn't playing tricks on me. If the voice came, we would have something that would not be dismissed by a well-meaning neighbor or a patronizing policeman. I felt ridiculous for wanting so much proof. I felt more ridiculous still for the relief that surged when Raphael pressed the red button and said, "Okay, I'm recording." That night I waited with the lights dimmed and the window cracked to listen to the rain. The clock ticked toward 1 with that slow, creeping solemnity of long nights. When the phone rang, it felt like something opening, something inside of me aligning with an old habit. I touched the phone as if waking an old friend. "Mom," said the voice. It was clearer than before, steadier. It said my name the way she always had, like a secret in a crowded room. "Beatrice, I began. "Mom," she interrupted softly. "They told you it was an accident. They lied." There it was. The sentence made the air on my skin feel cold. Something in me went simultaneously rigid and entirely dissolved. I could feel the recorder on the table like a living thing. "Who told me what?" I asked. I can still hear how small my voice sounded, how much room there was in the night for something to answer. "If you listen," she said, "you'll find the papers. The file with the name he used then. The photograph in the folder. There's a red string tied in the closet of the office." Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she made me promise to look for nothing else, to focus on the red string.
Raphael leaned forward and whispered, "Do you have any idea what she could mean?" He didn't ask it to be kind. He asked it because he had been a reporter long enough to know when a lead was being handed to him. "She's talking about the clinic," I said. "My baby was born there. Dr. Henrique was—" I stopped. The name felt like an exposed nerve. Say it aloud enough times, and the thing it invoked would become real in other people's mouths. For me, the name had the weight of a closed file and dusty photographs, of explanations stopped mid-sentence. "You remember the blue umbrella?" the voice said suddenly, unexpected as rain. It was the private thing. It was what made my hands go cold all over again. The recorder picked up every tiny breath she took after that phrase. If anyone ever argued that a voice on a line could not be known by memory, they did not understand the way love keeps small things to itself. "Light the inner heart," she added, the old code phrase that no other person had ever heard us use. The words fell into the room and landed there like proof. After the call ended, the house felt too big, and at the same time like a small box someone might seal and send away. Raphael pressed stop on his recorder and turned the little device toward me as if it were the only compass left. He asked me if I wanted to go to the police. I told him I didn't know. The thought of going to them with a recording that claimed my daughter had been murdered felt like walking into a market where everyone already decided what you were selling. Instead, we listened to the file over and over. The playback was not perfect. Voices hissed at the edges, and the rain made a soft static that clung to the words. But the phrases were there. The umbrella, the red string, the accusation that they lied. Raphael's mouth tightened when he heard the name Dr. Giuliano, the name Beatrice used like a small stone to throw into a pond. He said the name out loud as if tasting it, and then sat back. "You want me to do something?" I asked him, and it was an honest question, the kind you ask when you know the world will not rearrange itself for your grief. His reply was immediate. "Yes," he said, "because that recording, if it's genuine, changes this from a private haunting into a lead. People need to hear it who have records, who can check things, hospitals, registries, old newspapers. I'll start digging again." We made copies of the recording and sealed one in an envelope that I kept in the small box where I had stored Beatrice's school ribbons. Whenever the tape slid out from its paper, the smell of old ink rose up and made me think of classrooms and her small handwriting. The copy went to Raphael. Another copy we kept on a flash drive. We labeled files. We called a former investigator who had once been assigned to the original case and left him a message that sounded like the first step of a plan.
In the days that followed, the calls kept coming, not every night, but often enough that the rhythm of them became a part of my life. Sometimes the voice would give me a detail no one else could know, the place under the oak tree where Beatrice hid her notes, the exact time she wore her blue umbrella to the market because she liked the way it jangled against her wrist. Other times she pressed harder, like a finger in a fresh bruise, and said things that made my blood cold. "There is a sister," she would say, "and she is alive." Why would a dying girl, or a girl who had died, know about a sister hidden somewhere? I asked this question aloud more than once, pacing my small living room, the television off because light felt like an insult when your inside was a bruise. The recordings never gave me the whole story. They were fragments, intuition pressed into language. Beatrice would not, or could not, say names with clarity sometimes. She was a whisper when she needed to be a shout. Raphael started making calls to people who owed him favors. He revisited old articles, filed away under months and notes, and compared dates. He found inconsistencies, a birth certificate that had been signed with a different middle name, a record of a private adoption filed through unusual channels, a doctor's name that shifted between an initial and a different surname. It was the kind of thing reporters live for, a smudge on the public paper that might point to a system trying to hide its own mistakes. We found a name, Dr. Enrique Silva. He had been a respected physician in his day, known for a clinic that promised confidentiality and discreet adoptions. The files from the clinic were sparse, handwritten lists that looked like the work of someone who detested bureaucracy. Years later, a son had taken over, Paulo Enrique, who in records sometimes appeared as Dr. Giuliano. The double names, the use of different identities, these were threads Rafa could pull. One afternoon, as rain braced itself against the windows, Raphael sat with a spread-out map on my kitchen table and tapped a town I had never visited. "He has offices there," he said. "Small town, provincial hospitals, a private clinic. If he's been moving people around for years, it's a place to check." I went with him to the registry office for birth records. Standing in that sterile hall felt like stepping into a courtroom. We watched ink on paper for names that didn't fit, for dates that would not make sense. We learned the language of bureaucracy, how a missing stamp or a vague signature could hide a paper's true history. Raphael's fingers hovered over a folder, and then, just like that, settled on a line where a birth had two signatures that did not match, where a middle name that belonged to Beatrice was omitted entirely. It looked like a clerical error until you imagined the people who had time enough to turn errors into a pattern. I started to dream in small, sharp flashes of a child with dark hair opening an unfamiliar door and finding light. In the waking hours, the house felt like a hospital of memories. Every chair had a ghost-shaped outline in the cushion where she had sat. Friends from church were gentle. They brought soup. They did not ask whether I had been hallucinating. The world seemed to agree on being kind where it could. And yet, no matter how much paperwork we found, the thing that kept twisting inside me was the voice at 1 a.m., the tiny detail that no registry could explain, the smell of jasmine that always seemed to hover when she was near. Once, on a visit to a funeral home, I found a sprig of jasmine tucked into a bouquet someone had left. Its smell flung me back to a summer afternoon when Beatrice and I had sat on the stoop and she had tucked a blossom behind my ear, giggling like a child. That small thing, the scent, was the most private proof I had, better than signatures or lines in a ledger. It was a thing that stayed in the soft tissues of memory.
Then came the night of the recording that did more than accuse. It named a possibility. In a voice that was both sure and exhausted, Beatrice said, "There is a girl, my twin, Mariana. She is in a room without windows." She gave us a street name, only a street name, and then the line went dead. The phone in my hand went silent, as if someone had pressed a finger to the mouthpiece. I sat very still. All the maps and papers scattered across my table felt both immense and too small. Twin? The word echoed like the slow toll of a bell. I had always known Beatrice was my only child. That was what everyone said. But memory is a messy thing, and grief can hide secrets in its own patterns. The idea of a second child hidden away like a lost chapter was almost too monstrous to hold. And yet, when I repeated the name Mariana, it felt like greeting someone I had always known. Raphael did not sleep that night. He called an old contact at an investigative unit and left a message that could ripen into something official if returned. He drove to the archives and photocopied registrations, scanned them for anomalies, and then filled his pockets with coffee and files. I watched him work with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was the look of a man who had found a dark thread and would not let it rest. Days blurred into a pattern. Calls, papers, coffee, church candles. Father Antonio would sit with me sometimes and we would pray, but our prayers were small and practical. Give light to those who are blind to the truth. Steady the hands that must search. I could not pray with the kind of doctrinal certainty some people bring to their faith. My prayers were more like toggles. Turn on the light, reveal what must be revealed. I found myself whispering Beatrice's name into my palms at night like a mantra.
When the police finally responded, slow at first, then with a bureaucratic efficiency that both frightened and comforted me, they wanted the recording. We handed it over with the solemnity of people trading a relic. The detective who listened had the same tired kindness of someone who had seen too much and still showed up. He asked careful questions. He took notes in a language that promised official steps. When he left, he said words that meant something without saying everything. "We'll look into it. This will take time." Time was a commodity I had spent in the months since her death. It had worn thin at the edges. Yet the recording had shifted things. What had been a private late-night visitation had become a traceable event. The police could not ignore something recorded and sent through channels. Raphael's articles, small and cautious at first, began to outline the anomalies we had found. A doctor's shifting identity, missing signatures, a child's existence hinted at in a voice that would not let go. People whispered, of course. Some said the elderly sometimes mistook memory for reality. Others held their hands over their hearts and nodded like they understood the shape of loss. I learned to accept both reactions with a kind of tired grace. My life had always been public and private at the same time. Public in the way small tragedies attract attention, private in the way they eat you from the inside. It was in one of the quiet hours, always late, always when the world had gone to sleep, that the phone rang again. I had stopped being surprised at the sound. I now treated it as an old friend you kept answering because you owed it the courtesy. I pressed the call and heard first the wet scrape of fabric, then the voice. "Mom," she said, "they kept me with lullabies that weren't mine. There's a room with no windows, in a bed that never sees the sun. Find the red thread in the closet of the office. It's tied to a photograph. The photograph has 2 children. One looks like me and one looks like a shadow." That last image, Beatrice describing photographs and shadows, made my breath hitch. How could a voice from the past know where a red string lay in a closet I had never opened? The specifics made me tremble in the way only mothers know, a combination of terror and fierce clarity. I promised her I would look, though I had no idea where to start. Raphael's face when I told him was a portrait of something like compassion and obligation. He said, "If she named Mariana, then we can't ignore any avenue. Names are powerful. They bring people out of hiding." He said it with the journalist's old zeal and a tenderness that surprised me. He started tracing the name Mariana across every record he could find, like someone following a bird's migration across continents. In the stack of old photographs I kept in the attic, behind wedding albums and school programs, I found a picture that made my hands go cold. It was lab-labeled. Someone had left it in the wrong box. Someone, once upon a time, had thought it unimportant. It showed 2 small girls standing on a stoop, hair tied back, hands nearly touching.
One of them looked like Beatrice in all the ways that are genetic and undeniable. The other had features I could not place immediately, a small mouth and eyes that were guarded as if the camera were unwelcome. In the corner of the photograph there was a faint red thread, probably part of a ribbon someone was extra careful to keep, looped around a girl's finger, as if someone had tied it there to remember. I almost dropped the picture. My knees wanted to fold. I called Raphael at once. He came over and leaned over the photocopier like a man who had seen a map that pointed to treasure and ruin at once. He compared the photograph to the descriptions we had gathered. He said simply, "This could be something." My daughter's calls became the kind of compass that made the rest of life feel like a map in a drawer, still valuable but secondary. The scent of jasmine would sometimes drift through my apartment at odd hours. I would stop and breathe it as if it were a message pressed into fabric. Sometimes I would find the blue umbrella leaning against a chair, as if a young woman had only just left it there and would return any minute. Once in the attic, under a trunk of old winter coats, I found a small hair ribbon that matched the one in the photograph. It was ridiculous and exquisite to touch something that connected me to a moment I thought had been erased. We started to collect evidence in the more boring, thorough way adults do when they must make the world answer to them. Copies, dates, signatures, a chain of custody. Raphael kept a log. Father Antonio brought over witness statements from neighbors who remembered certain cars at odd hours near the clinic, and I sat with a stack of notes and traced each line until my eyes wired. At night, when the calls came, they alternated between gentle memories and clues so pointed they felt like blows. Sometimes Beatrice would coax me into doing something small and domestic, plant the jasmine, fix a top left on the counter, and I would follow the request because the tasks ground me back into being human. Other times she would say a name, a street, a detail that forced me to look up legal prescriptions or old patient lists. She never asked for praise or for me to declare the truth. She gave breadcrumbs. Then one evening when the sky was a bruised purple and the rain had stopped long enough to let the smell of wet stone climb into the air, the voice said something that made every other sound look like a lie. "Mariana remembers a lullaby," Beatrice said. "She hums it in a kitchen that is not hers. She remembers a blue umbrella and a woman who smelled like lemon soap. You can bring her back." Bringing her back sounded like magic.
It also felt like something exquisitely possible if the maze of names we had found actually led to a door. Raphael, who I think had been keeping himself awake for days, finally said the thing that none of us could both feel and name. "If there's even a chance she's alive somewhere, we have to act." He said it with an urgency that made my palms sting. I remember standing at my kitchen window, looking at the street lamp that buzzed outside, and thinking of the many ways a human heart can be divided and still hold enough courage to do what must be done. The involvement of the police, the whisperings of neighbors, the glowing red digits on the clock at night, they all became small parts of a larger instrument that had to be played. I felt something in me re-steady with each small step. Photocopy a file, call a contact, hand over a recording, ask a question that cannot be answered lightly. We were not ready then. We were assembling ourselves like people who try to construct a ladder from memory and faith. The recording rested in a manila envelope on my kitchen table. Raphael's notes were pinned and bookmarked, and the photograph with the red thread lay under a glass of water, an ordinary, clumsy altar to hope. The phone was by my side, and when it rang at odd hours, I would answer it with a practiced steadiness that surprised me. On the night before we planned to take anything official to the detective, I went to bed with the photograph under my pillow. The jasmine scent had swelled at the window for no obvious reason, and I could not sleep. I let my fingers trace the red thread in my dream, imagined the shadowed room Beatrice described, and heard again her small, certain voice. "Open the door. I'm cold." When the clock blinked 12:58, I woke and sat up. The house was full of the small sounds of living things breathing around the edges. I reached for my phone because habit had turned into strategy and pressed the screen to see if it was alive. The device's face glowed in the darkness. 12:59. I held my breath like someone waiting to hear the first note of a song that could change everything. At 1 a.m., the phone rang. The phone rang at 1. I froze with the receiver an inch from my face, waiting for the voice that had become both promise and wound. For a second, the world narrowed to the tiny island of light on my kitchen table and the thin thread of sound that could appear on the other end of it. "Mom," she said. Not a question now, a command softened by the rhythm of memory. "The office. The closet. Look for the red string and a photograph." My hands were steady because my heart had decided to be steady. My mind had another map. I pressed my thumb to the recorder on the table as if it were a talisman, and listened as if listening could make the world rearrange itself into truth. Where? I asked aloud, to the room and not to the voice. Where is the office?
She answered with a street name and a brief sound of someone folding something small, a paper, maybe, and then the line went dead, as if someone had simply hung up. I remember the way light looked through the window that night, the street lamp haloed in a ring, the rain gone, leaving the air cold and clean. I remember thinking then that everything that followed would be measured in small things, an address, a ribbon, a photograph. Those tiny facts were all the scaffolding grief could cling to. Before dawn, Raphael was at my door with fresh coffee and a map he had annotated in blue ink. He moved like a man who had already decided that sleep was an indulgence he could not afford. We made copies of the new recording and drove to the address she had given. It was a small clinic on the edge of a town I knew only from passing through. The sign was hand-painted, and the parking lot had a single lamp that buzzed in the night. We did not go in. You do not walk into places that could hold a child without someone who can make them answerable. We went to the police. We handed over the recordings, the photograph with the red thread, the list of names and inconsistencies Raphael had pulled from dusty registries. The detective who took our file had a patient look. He had worked long enough to understand that sometimes the thing that moves people to action is not a single smoking gun, but an accumulation of small, stubborn facts. There was paperwork. There were phone calls with people who used bureaucratic language and polite phrases that suggested they would do what they could. There were days, the kind that feel like a holding pattern, where we felt both on the edge of something and utterly stalled. The detective let us know an officer would look into the clinic's registration and, if enough evidence was gathered, to prepare an application for a search warrant. Raphael kept pushing. He called contacts who could speed things up. Father Antonio prayed and wrote a short letter of support, which he handed to the detective as if a prayer could be a small human endorsement. We had to wait for the law to move, and waiting is a practice of its own. I learned how to keep breathing in the small spaces. I learned to keep the notebook where I wrote down the times the calls came, the words she used, the small things she asked me to look for. Each entry was a bead strung carefully on a thread I hoped would one day make a necklace long enough to hang on the neck of truth. When the phone rang on the day the warrant was executed, I could tell from the way Raphael answered that something had shifted. There were extra cars outside the clinic that day, marked vehicles in a line like quiet sentries. People who had previously been polite and removed now moved with a practical urgency. I rode in the car with Raphael and the detective, my knees hollow with a loneliness that felt sharper than the cold. We arrived at the clinic while light still had the thin, exact quality of morning after rain. Officers moved through the small waiting room with the care of people who know how to make a house speak. The search was thorough. Drawers were opened, files were photographed, closets were examined. The detective had a warrant, and he had patience, and those two things make for a formidable pair. They found the photograph with two girls, the one I had kept in the attic, tucked inside a manila folder in Dr. Giuliano's office. It had been placed behind a stack of patient intake forms, forgotten or hidden, I could not tell which. The red thread was looped around the corner of the picture as if someone once wanted to be sure it would not be lost. The photograph's print corners were softened by years, but the image was as sharp as a memory. The two girls, standing on a stoop, their hands nearly touching. They found other things too, ledgers with names that move like shadows across time, notes recording adoptions arranged quietly, informally, a pattern of transfers and signatures that did not fit the routines expected in a clinic run by reputable hands. There were references to special arrangements, entries that were vague enough to belong to any number of legal explanations and precise enough to make a reporter's teeth set. Everything they photographed was folded into the case like a seam being sewn. But the most difficult door to open was not an office door. It was the one that led to the locked room in the house Dr. Giuliano kept at the rear of the property. Officers found a service entrance, and beyond it a small apartment that looked from the outside like the residence of a man who preferred his private life discreetly arranged. Inside, beneath the stairs, they found a door bolted from the outside. I remember standing in the hallway while they worked the bolt, and the silence it made when it gave way. I remember the detective's face when he opened the door. He did not look triumphant, only focused. The room was small and painted neutral, like a waiting room one puts inside someone's life to keep things civilized. There was a narrow bed and a mirror. The window had been covered over on the outside so no light could enter. On the floor near the bed was a small blanket neatly folded and a plate untouched. There was a faint chemical smell in the air that made the officers cover their noses. Clinical and disinfectant-like. Not the romance of florals, but the dryness of something meant to sterilize a place into silence. In the corner, partially under the bed, they found someone curled up as if trying to make herself small enough to be missed. She was awake in the way someone who has been given very little daylight is awake. Slow, careful, as if room and body were strangers negotiating. Her hair was tangled, and there was a thinness to her that took my breath away.
They lifted a corner of the blanket, and a small hand reached out as if to brace against a new world. I walked in only after they had assured me it was safe, and when I saw her, I could not speak, because language had not prepared me for the shape of my own child's face on another body. She looked at me with a mix of suspicion and hunger, and then, as if a thread inside her had been pulled, she began to hum, a simple tune, a lullaby I had sung 1,000 times when she was small. The sound was ragged at first, like someone learning to breathe again, but it was the same sequence of notes that had been with us for years. It made something in my chest unclench. Her name was Mariana. It was the first word the detective said when he had understood the paperwork we had found. I said it aloud like a benediction. She blinked, and then the slow work of recognition began. A small surety in her eyes, a tilt of the head that matched the photographs. She reached for my hand as if remembering the weight of a palm she had once known. There were no cinematic miracles, no instantaneous healing. The officers were careful and professional. They called medical personnel, who came and checked vital signs and spoke to the detective in calm, neutral tones. Blood pressure, hydration, sedation levels from what had been recorded in the small jar of empty medicine containers they found. The hospital stayed with her for observation. The police took statements. Dr. Giuliano, whose legal name, when it mattered for the file, was Paulo Enrique, was arrested on the spot and led away with his hands cuffed. He gave brief answers when questioned, his voice small and defensive. He denied certain aspects and admitted others. In his statements to the officers, he used language I would later hear repeated in court papers. Obsession, a desire to control, justification dressed in tenderness. Those were his words, given to detective notes. I do not speak them as explanation, only as what he said. The charges the police filed were precise and sober: kidnapping, illegal adoption procedures, falsifying documents, and an active inquiry into circumstances surrounding my daughter's death reopened with his name now under scrutiny. I am careful in how I say this, because law has a pace that does not cheat grief. Arrests are steps, not completions. The paperwork that followed took months: affidavits, testimony, the slow grinding of legal gears. But that morning, when I first touched Mariana's hand, what mattered was the small miracle of a living person returning to the circle of light. Mariana could not tell us everything. She had gaps in her memory that were obvious, and other gaps she wrapped in silence. She had been kept sedated at times, the doctor said. There were medications they cataloged in the evidence that seemed intended to dull and to standardize sleep.
She remembered smells more than days. Soap that smelled of lemon, the tang of antiseptic, the occasional unfamiliar food that sometimes came with a lullaby she did remember. She remembered the lullaby and the blue umbrella. In hospital, she lay still and let the nurses wash away the layers of care meant to keep her quiet. For days, she ate only soup and sips of juice. For nights, she woke and looked for a light to turn on. The first time I brushed the hair away from her face, she flinched and then relaxed, as if she had been waiting for that gesture all along. The photograph with the red thread had been put beside her bed. I took it out and showed it to her. She studied it as if it were something she was finding inside herself, and then, in a voice that sounded like it was stitched from fragments, she said the name of the street where she had been kept. We moved slowly. Recovery is a long series of small reconciliations: to touch without shock, to look at a mirror and not panic, to be inside a kitchen and notice sunlight again. Mariana's first laugh in months startled me more than any cry I had heard in the years without Beatrice. It was raw and pure, and it made the room tilt. She learned to put socks on by herself. She learned with stubborn concentration to tie her hair back. We found the blue umbrella in an old closet inside the clinic's office, something small and ridiculous and exactly what memory demands, and Raphael wrapped it carefully and placed it against my kitchen wall like a flag. There were other things that did not fix themselves so quickly. Mariana had nightmares. She had days when she would not leave the bed, and other days when she would stand at the window for an hour, watching rain as if it were a new ocean. There were legal appointments, medical follow-ups, counseling sessions that came with uncomfortable chairs and tissue boxes, and people who used steady, soft language. Friends from church brought casseroles that smelled like home. Father Antonio came with small, steady prayers that did not promise miracles, but promised presence. Beatrice's calls smote after the rescue. They did not stop abruptly. They thinned, tapering like the last notes of a song. Sometimes at night I would hear nothing but the ticking of the clock and a phantom of a ringtone that my mind had learned to expect. Sometimes, inexplicably, when I would open a drawer to find a ribbon or a photograph, there would be for a moment the faint scent of jasmine, as if a window in another place had been cracked just enough for the smell to slip through. I never took those incidents as proof of doctrine. I took them as comfort, as pieces of a life that had not been fully erased. Raphael kept writing. His articles were cautious and humane. He wrote about the documents, the inconsistencies, the way a small-town silence can become a system. He did not sensationalize. He treated Mariana as a person, not an emblem. He treated me as a narrator of events, not an exhibition.
The detective sent an initial report to the prosecutor, and the case moved into the hands of people whose job it was to turn facts into legal action. I was present at some hearings. At others, I read the summaries Raphael sent me and marked the days on my calendar like small victories. There were things I could never reconstruct in full. The exact pathway of how a girl came to be taken, the full extent of documents falsified to move a life into someone else's care. Those spaces remained partially dark. The world is always like that, stitched badly in some places, tightly in others. But there was enough light for Mariana to walk into, with both of us supporting her. Months later, she moved into my small apartment. I had left a spare bedroom threaded with simple curtains and Beatrice's old quilts folded in the closet. The first night she slept in a bed that knew how to hold a person without calculating the price was like a small festival. She woke at dawn and made tea with the careful concentration of someone reclaiming tiny rituals. We planted a jasmine at the window, the same one Beatrice used to tuck behind my ear. It was a small thing, an act of domestic faith. A pot, soil, a spade, my hands dirty for the first time in a long time. She put the blue umbrella by the door and sometimes left it open in the hall like a bizarre kind of welcome mat. She learned to cook again from Miriam at the church, who taught with patience and measured spoons. She started to speak of the future in small increments, buy a vase, hang a picture, visit the market on Thursdays. There were days when she would hum that lullaby and then break off and say she didn't remember why she started. We would exchange looks that stored 1,000 meanings. And me? What did I do with the daughter who had been gone and the daughter who had returned? I learned that having two kinds of grief can live in the same house. I would sometimes hold Beatrice's photograph and feel both the clean, aching absence and the dense, particular joy that a hand in my own could bring. I would lay a small plate of food on the table at night and whisper things that felt embarrassingly ordinary. Eat, Mari. Drink your tea. Did you sleep well? Those small commands were how I anchored the family back into being family. There were quiet signs, too. One clear evening, I found the kitchen smelling faintly of jasmine without any obvious source. I asked Mariana about it, and she smiled like someone who had been given a secret and said, "It's probably the plant, isn't it?" She shrugged, and for a second we both pretended to be mundane. It did not matter what the explanation was. There are truths that live better as mysteries than as answers. The legal process continued. Paulo Henrique was formally charged, and the inquiry into my daughter's death was reopened. Court dates blurred into one another. The press sometimes revisited the case, and then the public moved on, as it always does.
But the ongoing work was not public spectacle. It was meetings with lawyers, testimony, the slow, often invisible machinery of justice. My part was to be a witness, to what I had heard, to what the recordings had preserved, to the photograph with its red thread and the blue umbrella. At night, sometimes I would wake up and check my phone. The green numbers would read 1 a.m., and a part of me would hold its breath. But the phone did not ring at that hour in the way it had. The calls that had once come like weather grew rarer, gentler. Once, months after the rescue, I picked up the receiver and held it for a long time. I said nothing, because I did not need proof anymore. I had a living child under my roof, and a story with enough corroboration to make the authorities move. There were moments when I thought of Beatrice not as an accusation or a ghost, but as an ally, imperfect, human, and fierce, in whatever form she had taken to reach us. I do not stand here to claim to convert doubt into doctrine. I only know what I felt and what happened. The recordings exist, the photograph exists, the hospital records exist.
A girl who had been supposed to be lost now sat at my kitchen table folding napkins with the clumsy care of someone making a home. Time, as it does, carried on. Mariana enrolled in therapy and learned to put up curtains that let in light. She laughed, real laughter that made the old house tilt in a good way. Sometimes she would pause and touch a ribbon, and then look up at me with a question that was almost a prayer. I would tell her stories about a blue umbrella that had never really been fashionable, and about a woman who smelled like jasmine, and who could, apparently, cross the thin places between memory and action. On the anniversary of Beatrice's death, we went to the church. Father Antonio made no grand pronouncements. He simply prayed for courage, for justice, and for the comfort of those who wait. I lit 2 candles that night, one for Beatrice and one for Mariana, and set them side by side. The flames were small and bell-like, and they looked as if they could do what human hands cannot always do, keep a night from swallowing them whole. There are people who will read this and want a tidy ending. There is no tidy ending to what we lived. There is slow repair. There are papers that still need signatures. There are nights when Mariana will wake and shiver, and I will fetch extra blankets. There are days when the phone rings and it is someone else, and I answer with the same careful attention. There is counseling to be done and trust to be rebuilt, and the daily work of living that asks for our steady, imperfect courage. If you are here because the title of this story caught you, my daughter, who passed away 4 years ago, called at 1 a.m., open the door, I'm cold, then you know how a single line can unmoor a life and steer it. That call changed everything for us. It pushed us from private grief into action.
It gave Raphael a lead he could follow, and the police grounds to pry open doors that had been closed for too long. It returned a girl named Mariana to a life she had been denied. It taught me that love does not stop at the border most people think death draws. I do not claim to have answers for those who have lost someone. I only tell what happened. A voice in the night that insisted on certain facts, a photograph with a red thread, a blue umbrella, the scent of jasmine, a recorder that would not let memory be dismissed, and people who would not let the case be shelved. You can call it a visitation, a coincidence, or a string of events that lined up at the right time. For me, it was a series of moments that braided together until rescue was possible. If this story resonates with you, if you have known loss or have been touched by strange comforts in the dark, I invite you to share a word in the comments. We read them, and we are strengthened by the knowledge that we are not alone. If you want to keep hearing accounts like this, consider subscribing. It helps us tell more stories that matter. And if anyone here carries a burden too heavy to bear alone, seek help. Reach out to a trusted friend, a local support group, or a counselor. There are people who will listen. Tonight, when I go to bed, I sometimes set the clock a little before 1 o'clock and look at the green digits huddled in the dark. I do it not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The house is full again, noisy, messy, alive. Mariana keeps the blue umbrella near the door. The jasmine grows by the kitchen window. I keep Beatrice's photograph on the shelf where the light finds it in the morning. Sometimes when the wind comes in and the night is very still, I feel, oddly, precisely, the warmth of small breath on my shoulder, like a memory settling back into place. I cannot prove what that is, but I know this. I opened the door the world offered me when it mattered. I answered a call. I trusted small facts and the people who helped me gather them. In the end, that was enough to bring back a person who had been lost to us and to make our house a home again.